I look out and I am seeing something more beautiful than we can possibly know on earth. There are a lot of good man-made organizations, those that do a lot of good, and they're to give credit for that. Credit and honor is due. But nothing compares to the heaven-born, blood-bought body of the redeemed. This is the body, and we are here to be an example to the world. And if anything that they should know us for, yes, our love. By their love, they shall know that you're my disciples. But our love for one another is affected by our love for God. This lesson is meant to stretch your faith. There are a lot of things that will be not mentioned particularly or in particular, but they will be clear if you're focused and listening. And even at that, I'll say, do you love God enough to give Him your full focus during this lesson? I want this lesson's effect to be that you walk out this building knowing you love God and then having a desire to love Him more. As we look at Abraham, and in the special series that we've been in, and now we are concluding today, you've been through a lot in life, no doubt. I have a question. What all have you been through? Think about that. And yet we're all here to worship God. Think about all you've been through. I want to quickly caution you and cushion your spirit and say, you have no trial, nor will you face any trial that you will not outlive. That's encouraging, isn't it? Because eternity in heaven is our goal. But think about all you have been through, trials that I don't know. I'm still learning you, and I've learned a lot about the things you've gone through. But there's a lot you've gone through that I don't know. Same can be said about me to you as well as we learn each other. But maybe we've gone through, admittedly, not as much as others. But maybe we've gone through more than some others, perhaps. Came up with a phrase, and I want to share it with you in this encouraging context. We ponder the meaning of life. Salvation is the mission. Holiness is the intention. Heaven is the focus. Christ is the compass. Eternal relationship is the purpose. So is your faith in God and is your faith, love for God so matured, so strong that you would worship Him no matter what? The brain is an amazing computer. If you ask it a question, it'll come up with an answer, whether the answer is true or false. But do you love God? Do you have faith and trust in God enough to worship Him no matter what? Is your perspective of life that clear? What scenario would be so intense that would cause you to doubt your own devotion and commitment to God, whether by life or by law? We ask questions like this to evaluate our own selves, of course. That question is not meant for you to come up with an answer. It's just to make you wonder about the commitment of your own soul. Abraham went through more than I would venture to say any of us ever will. He went through the most developing trial of his life. And the trial that we're going to discuss today, the thing that we remember Abraham most for, causes every Christian to think, do I have enough faith to do that? Well, we're going to bookend that question and ease your mind towards the end of this sermon. If you've ever wondered, do I have enough faith as Abraham to do that? Am I a good Christian? Am I a good follower of God? Well, this has been a very basic series, and the Bible is our course, our curriculum, and what particular focus is on Genesis, the life of Abraham. And Hebrews chapter 11, 17 through 19 is our bookend verse. It's our pillar text. It's what we are focusing on throughout this whole lesson, and we will read it towards the end. Just leave your Bible open right there. I love those verses. Feel free to read them in advance if you want to, but keep your ears open now. Let's focus on this. Living by faith. Living by faith. As the Bible defines it, what is faith? According to Hebrews 11:1, a modern version with the same meanings behind the words say, it's being sure of what you hope for, certain of what you do not yet see. I love the evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things not yet seen, because we know God has a proven track record. He will fulfill His promises. He says it. It's for me. If I do my part to yield to His will, then He will fulfill His word to me, and that's life and salvation. I look forward to that. Look forward to it. It's not just a shot in the dark. It's an eager anticipation. So I have that faith in God. That solid hope and trust that God will fulfill his word. Think about Abraham, the covenant he made with him. And now Isaac is in the picture. Beyond all reason and hope and logic of circumstances, God brought Isaac into this world. But then there's a test that Isaac is the focal point of as we look at Abraham's devotion. How much do you love God? To conclude our series, we're going to look at this School of Faith mini semester here. And we're going to look at the covenant that God made, and he came and gave to Abraham. And he says, your descendants will be more numerous than the stars of the sky, and through your child, the world will be blessed. And you and I are part of that blessing. Children of Abraham by faith through the covenant of the Messiah coming through his lineage. It's beautiful. Now, Genesis chapter 12 is where we started. God called Abraham out. That walking by faith lesson. God called Abraham out. I find it interesting that the word for church in the New Testament is ecclesia. The call out of this world, the call together for purposes of being righteousness, and the call for the purpose of being light in a world of darkness. We are the called. God called Abraham out so that you could be called out. The lesson warring by faith, the trials that we face, the burdens, the opposition, both from without and from within. Waiting by faith, waiting 25 years when there's nothing else you can do but still serve God, knowing that he, in his own good time, perfect time, will give the blessings that he has promised. Working by faith. Working by faith. Obeying God, giving him your all. That's our focus. That's been the summary to this point. Now, Genesis chapter 22, worship by faith. You're already familiar with this story, Isaac, of course. And by the time he comes along, Sarah was 90 years old. Abraham was 100 and plus, and moving forward in time. But by Genesis 22, he had already grown into a fine young man, a fine-looking young man. And Abraham, of course, God comes to him and says, take your son, only son, and I know you love him, go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there. Sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about. This is a unique test. It's not uniformly parallel to any of the worship perhaps that we do. We don't give human sacrifice, for sure. We don't have animal sacrifices anymore, thankfully. We don't offer blood sacrifices. Hebrews 9 talks about, though there were a time when, of course, there were ceremonial purposes to this. Verse 14 of Hebrews 9 says, how much more then will the blood of Christ, through the eternal Spirit, offered himself and unblemished to God, a sacrifice to God, cleanse your conscience from all the acts of death, basically. It's encouraging to think that through Christ, he took care of our greatest need. Those animal sacrifices couldn't do it. But nonetheless, we don't offer blood sacrifices. We don't build altars like Abraham did. We don't sing the songs that Abraham did. We don't go up to a mountain to worship, although now it can be anywhere. But there are a lot of differences in his worship that we're going to focus on today and the worship we give to God now in the Christian era and in America. But there are some parallels, and the biggest parallel is this, the main one. We worship the same God. We worship the same God. And it was the same God 500 years later who would speak to Moses in a burning bush and would be asked the question by Moses, who do I say sent me or sends me? And God says, I am that I am. Tell him I am sent you. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not I was, but I am. When it comes to the God that we worship, I want you to feel so personally attached to this God who created us. We're here because of him. That I want you to know the same God that Abraham is worshiping by this amazing trial of who do you love more is the same God that we worship today. And the lesson that Abraham learned will be appreciated by us, hopefully more so, at the lesson's conclusion. Number one, some eternal principles we're going to focus on. Number one, when it comes to the similarities between Abraham's worship and the truth of how we all should worship. Worship involves sacrifice. God says, Abraham, take your son, your most beloved son Isaac, and offer him as a burnt offering. Now, I want to stop right there. Worship has two meanings. A lot of people who don't want to worship God, who don't love him as much as they do their own life in this world, will say, I can worship God anywhere, right? But There is an idea that your whole life is a worship to God, and it's clearly implied by Romans chapter 12, verse 1. I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. This is your duty. This is your reasonable service. Like we mentioned in class, grace changes me. It should get us out of the old way and put us into the new life of righteousness. So in that sense, my life is a worship to God. The second use of worship is not to be ignored. It is used many times, not sometimes when you're alone, yes, but more often when you're together with other believers. There are assembled acts of worship, procedures that we go through, traditions with meaning, commands with purpose. But the point of the matter is that whether you're talking about the life that you live or the worship that we're offering up to God right now in our hearts, the principles we're going to focus on are still true all the time, because we've been asked to sacrifice so much. What does this mean by sacrifice? I've got to clarify that term. We think of a burnt offering, an animal on an altar. What does it mean that you and I sacrifice now? Well, I heard a good definition last week. Sacrifice means to give up something important to you to something that's more important. Think about that meaning. Good sacrifice. Giving up something that's important to you to something more important. Your time. Your life is your time. Giving up your time, giving up your life. What's more important to you? You're here right now. That's good. Some people don't value that 1 hour for sure that we come together, or maybe 2 hours on a Sunday morning. They value that more to themselves than to God. Some people don't want to give up their heart, your passions, your thoughts, what fills your heart, the wellspring of life. We're asked to sacrifice our hands and our efforts and our energies, our attention, our focus. Are you loving God enough to give Him your focus during this lesson? Do you love God with every fiber of your being? Abraham taught us a long time ago that if I'm going to worship God, it's going to demand a sacrifice. But there's another eternal principle. If I worship God, as well we all have this morning, it involves complete obedience. Not just to the point that it aligns with my will and, oh, here's a statement or a command, I don't want to do that. Partial obedience, therefore, is disobedience. A heart fully yielded to God reveres His word, deeply fears and respects His word to follow it because of the love for God. As bizarre as this sounds, Abraham was given a command to offer a human sacrifice, and that sounds so weird. Maybe more weird than you might know, you and I might know, because Abraham was called out to be different than the world, of course. And while in the land of Canaan, not yet given to the people of his inheritance, I'll say, it's not that time yet, while he was living, tribes were all around him, offering human sacrifices with various methods. And here is the God of antiquity that has always said, way back, don't you shed innocent blood. God has always valued human life made in His image. And yet here is Jehovah God saying, offer Isaac. Not just any child, but the promised child. Something's different here. Doesn't make any sense at all to Abraham at the time, but it's much clearer later, and we will appreciate that difference soon. Genesis chapter 22 now, verse 3. Genesis 22, verse 3. Early the next morning, I'm sure it was early the next morning. I doubt he got any sleep. Whew. Abraham got up, saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place where God was going to show him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance and said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. One of the greatest questions of all Scripture is asked by Isaac. Where's the lamb? Spoken by the lamb. And for the father to look back, I don't know about the drama that could have captioned this. I don't think any actor could do a good job with this. The drama, the passion, the love, to give the answer. God will provide. And did He ever? But Abraham doesn't know what's in the future. Now God knows, but Abraham had to develop to this. This is very crucial. Verse 9. When they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. I don't know if any director could capture the true emotion of this. Was he going to, Michael? If he wasn't going to, an angel wouldn't have had to stop him. We know that. But now wait a minute. Do you know what Abraham understood in all of this? Let's get into the mind of Abraham. He did not understand the nature of this command yet. We look back and we see a lot of historical, theological significance. We look back and we understand the why behind it, but Abraham did not. He didn't understand what was in God's mind. To him, it was a question, what do I love more? God wanted Abraham to understand something that he had already grown to understand to this point in life anyway, and that is this: worship is for his glory and benefit and honor. And I think we forget that sometimes. I think a lot of times we focus effective worship, we judge effective worship by, well, personal preferences, what we like or don't like. Maybe sometimes by tradition, the songs that fit our desired temperament or tone or mood or tempo, whatever the case might be. Sometimes this is the reason. If you leave God out of the picture and you come together for worship, whatever you're worshiping, if it's not God, you're thinking in terms of, well, let's add this and let's subtract this based on what we like or what the public or majority wants. But worship is for God's glory. It's at God's bidding. Worship acceptable by God is dictated by God, and I think we forget that. It's all about Him. Worship is to be done God's way for His glory, and that's all the way established back in Genesis 4. When Cain killed Abel, because Abel represented the embodiment of the guilt when Cain did not worship God like God had told him to. You do what God says. It's all about God. It really is all about God. And then the blessings are to be a side note, truly. Verse 7 in Genesis 4 says, Cain, basically God is saying, you know what's right and you're not doing it. Worship is to be at God's bidding for His glory. So it involves complete obedience. Abraham, I want you to worship me. Offer Isaac as your sacrifice. Complete obedience. Now, point 3. Worship by faith means you're motivated by faithfulness of God. God's faithfulness motivates me to worship Him. A lot of people don't worship the God that exists because they don't know the God of the Bible. They just don't know God. The more you learn about God, the more you want to worship Him. He is faithful, true, and always sound. I'm not worshiping God to placate an unreasonable, irresponsible, angry, irrational deity. I'm not worshiping God to appease Him. I'm worshiping a God of the Bible of love and soundness and consistency. How confusing was this command to Abraham? The next day it says he went straight to Moriah, stacked the wood, raised the knife. Have you ever thought what he must have been thinking? Look at now verse 4. Let's look at verse 4. There are some clues here in the Old Testament clue here as to what he must have been thinking in a Hebrew reference later. On the third day, when they looked up and saw the place in the distance, he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over to worship there." Now look at this. We will worship Him, or we will worship God, and then we will come back to you. We have all had a lot of thoughts along this line, and you probably have heard sermons about this in the past. Now wait a minute here. We will come back to you. Did Abraham get confused? Did he forget? Was he trying to put on a front or mislead so that the boy wouldn't be tipped off or someone else won't try to stop him? Or what was going on here? I think that there's more to it than this, than even all of that I mentioned. Genesis 17, verse 9. I'm sorry, Genesis 17, look at verse 19. We talk about the promise that he was given there. Let your eyes glance on that. I think he was remembering the promise that God had given him, the promise that, yes, your wife Sarah is going to bear a son named Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him. And of course, through him, your descendants will be blessed. Abraham was no doubt remembering this promise. God brought Isaac into the world. That's a promise they waited a long time for. So trust in God had already been established, but to this level, to do what God had said specifically to him, he remembered the promise through Isaac. God said, now kill him. I'm going to bless your descendants through him. But he doesn't have any descendants right now. God promised, though, that his descendants would be blessed, and yet to be sacrificed. How do you reconcile this? It doesn't seem to be logical. He was serving a promise-keeping God. God says, yes, this is what's going to be. Hebrews chapter 11 now. Let's jump all the way to the New Testament as it looks back, showing you how it led to the new and so many similes, types, foreshadowings that we see here. Hebrews 11, 17 and following says, and I love to hear the pages turn, that's great. Or the fingers tapping if you're on the screen that way. Oh, it's good, this is so good. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. There's no way to reconcile this right now. It makes no sense. Look at verse 19. Abraham reasoned this, that God could raise the dead. Figuratively, Isaac was brought back from the death, but Abraham said, now God says for me to sacrifice my son, and I will. God's promised that through my son, the nation will be blessed. The whole world will be blessed. But what's God going to do? I don't know. I guess he's going to raise him from the dead. Now, we look back and we know that God's pretty good at that. Through Jesus and the miracles performed, and Jesus himself, we know that God can raise the dead. He's the God of the living. But at this point, unless I'm mistaken, that had never occurred in human history. And yet Abraham thinks this about God. That is faith. That's faith. We serve a promise-keeping God, and that motivates my worship of him, to keep his word of my salvation and eternal home with him, and providential care along the way. 1 Corinthians 10:13, you ever feel overwhelmed? God's not going to give you, of course, anything above what you can handle. And, well, that's not the right wording of it, but the application of the words is beyond what you were able to bear, and I might add, what he will help you bear as you grow. Romans 8:28, all things are going to work together for good to them that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose, which is being like Christ, serving him in the kingdom. Well, I'm encouraged. I want to receive that promise, and so why would I nullify myself from receiving the blessing of that promise by quitting? Makes no sense. Worship God. Wait upon him. He will fulfill that word. And John 14, 2 Corinthians 5:1 talks about we have a house, an eternal home, not made with hands, but with God. He's going to fulfill that word. He has a pretty good track record. Well, if that doesn't make you want to worship God, the God of the Bible, then I don't know what will. I want you to really be thinking about the God that we serve is above and beyond anything that we can conceive, but he has revealed it us in his word. The God that deserves to be praised and honored with everything we've got. And like I mentioned, this is only a side note. When you worship the way God has commanded, you do get blessings, spiritual blessings. Genesis 22, starting at verse 12, I want you this afternoon to put your finger marker there, whatever, this afternoon, from verse 12 and following, just read the rest of that and see how God heaps blessing after blessing and praise and blessings upon Abraham because of how he worshiped him, getting to that point where he had to answer the question that we all do. I truly love God more than anything else. We do all we do because of God. And that's the point. I want to mention this to you, though. My life is to be acceptable to God, and I have to obey him, and it starts with, of course, obedience to his will. But if you're wondering, do I have enough faith as Abraham? Do I have enough faith to think that I'm worthy enough to be acceptable to God if I don't think I could do what Abraham did? Let me put your mind at ease, please. Let me put your mind to rest on that. Instead of asking yourself, could I have enough faith as Abraham then? Ask yourself, do I have enough faith and trust and love in God to do what he commands me right now? Isn't that the most important question? Will I do what God wants me to do right now? You see in the comparisons, of course, God stopped In this case, the contrast, God stopped Abraham from offering his only son. But God the Father did not stop himself from offering his only son, so that you and I could be in a relationship with him. And our whole life is a worship according to how God would desire it. Thank you for letting me share this special series. I think it's been a lot to me as we get to learn the Father of the faithful. I want you to be a child of Abraham by faith. And that means in the Christian era doing what God says through Christ, the promised Messiah, who did come into this world as a result of the covenant that God made with Abraham. Will you put him on in baptism? And to do what you know you must, obeying God as he has said, as we stand and as we sing the song of encouragement.